Vulnerability is not about winning or losing. It's truly about this courage of showing up in the world that we live in right now. Having the courage to show up and be seen, especially in a space where you have no control, is probably on the minds of a lot of people, probably on the minds of ours. Welcome back to A Limiting Being. Hello, Dr. Summers.
Morning.
For our listeners, if this is your first time attending, we have been showing up, really creating a space, a community for understanding what it means to be grounded and the idea of ever growing and really leaning into areas, specifically that we've talked about is, how we nurture and, feed ourselves and really realizing it's all integrated in how we think, how we move, and how we be. And our last couple of conversations was really leaning into some of Brene Brown's work around emotions and what they are. I think we tapped into gratitude and the idea of being authentic. And so today we really wanted to explore something a bit more tender, essential to really our human experience that maybe doesn't get enough attention is the idea of vulnerability and what it means to be seen and take, those emotional risks of showing up even when we can't control the outcome of what's happening. So I'm joined with Dr. Summers today, and we're going to dive in and try to, feel out what does that mean to us, how we've experienced it, and maybe some practical tips of how to explore it yourself.
Right. Good morning, Liz. Yeah, I think it's one of those words that probably the hair on our listeners' backs is probably standing up because it really does get down to something that's, I think a human experience. And I think part of what we're trying to do is to put words into what these experiences are and create a safe space, right? I think that's really important. As far as our message is that, how do we find those that can share this experience with us and with friends and family? And that's where our experiences start, right? I mean, our lives have been born into these experiences and how we navigate those. So,
And I think, part of why I liked when you stated vulnerability is an idea for this conversation. And Brene's work, she more or less states that it's being vulnerable creates space for the joy, tapping into, the experience, really creativity and the idea of just love, right? So, when you think about being around your loved ones or your close friends or even your peers or, your network, when you have those moments where you walk away from the experience, if you really tie back to if it was a time or a moment that you would want to re-experience again, it's typically because there's vulnerability in that conversation and that ability to open up and share yourself and what you're experiencing.
no, totally. And we have hierarchies, sort of expectations. We've got parents and children, and my kids are now young adults. So there's a more equal footing of sorts, but you're always a parent, right? So, and you go home, you fall back into sometimes those sort of, ritualized sort of relationships of what happens. It does take a little bit of work. I mean, I think a lot of the work that Brene Brown has done is just working on self-awareness, right? And I think part of the vulnerability is part of what we're going to try to talk about is sort of self-compassion, right? It sort of begins with us each individually, of self-awareness, but being kind to ourselves, right? Loving ourselves, right? So once we can do that, that really helps us to move forward in this whole vulnerability conversation, I think, because it's really the sort of grounding of that.
Yeah, and I feel, even in her book, Daring Greatly, but vulnerability is not about winning or losing. It's truly about this courage of showing up in the world that we live in right now. Having the courage to show up and be
Right.
seen, especially in a space where you have no control, is probably on the minds of a lot of people, probably on the minds of ours. So it's real in parenting, in the relationships you're building, in those that you're leading. So for you, if you want to share, or
Yeah.
an experience of something in your own life that you felt vulnerability was the teacher in a certain situation.
Yeah, I think sort of, just in the practice of medicine and sort of like being owned by these large businesses, right? It's really, you're expected to sort of fall in line with things. And I mean, there's something to be said for, the continuity of things, and they have an image that they want and a certain sort of ethos. But then it does get down to the inner workings. I think transforming our practice from a independent primary care practice, pediatric practice, to part of this conglomerate, right? We tried to sort of massage it to keep some of the small business family. I mean, because I think we look at our practice even within this big structure as a family. Our employees, even though we're employed by the mothership, we're really a small contingency of that in our day to day, because we don't interact. And because we're not in the hospital, we don't have interactions with lots of others in the system in that way. But part of the vulnerability was sort of also finding my way to go beyond the practice. I think, seeing that, not that I wasn't satisfied in the practice, but I felt there was a need that wasn't being nurtured within the organization, which took a little bit of risk. And even, I'd say, going plant-based really rocked the boat for many of my family members, who to this day, am I getting enough protein, when I come
How
over to
many
the
years
house?
later?
It's 10 years later, right? And so I think that was probably one of the vulnerable moments, I guess, in some respects, because I mean, I'd eaten everything, cheese and meat and everything, and just learning about some of the health consequences. It's not to say, think that the isms and veganism and all these sort of things also take us down different paths, which we've sort of discussed over time in our previous conversations. And I think there's space for everybody to find their way, and sort of accepting the fact that people are going to be different and they're going to have different paths forward, but just being able to, I think, as you mentioned earlier, just the authenticity of being who you are. And I think part of what our systems are trying to make us something that the organizations want us to be, which may not be our authentic selves. And I think the key to a successful organization is having sort of a process which allows people to be their authentic selves, yet work in an organization. And that is not easy.
Um, so I just so many things you said led me to share this story. So when I think about for our listeners, by day, uh, in the energy industry, where I'm really working and leading, uh, to energize empowered thought leadership. So I've worked in the utility space for 20 plus years. And I remember, at the very beginning, right out of school, I had a team that I became very close knit with. We were consultants, so we were traveling, we were working all the time. And, the friendships and the bonds that were formulated very quickly for me was something that I cherished. And, it's a male dominated industry. And so I remember, I was also in this exploratory journey. We're trying to really understand like how I was blending my work life. And so I started drafting these like emails to my team, which I was just like an individual contributor at that time. So even including my boss, of some of the learnings from some of this conversation, like Brene Brown would have been one of my authors. And I would like wanted to really share with them why I thought we were so powerful in the work that we were doing, because we were, it was fun times. It was a small group. We were asked to grow. We were going into utilities. We were creating all these beautiful friendships. We were serving others, but I don't think anyone thought it as that, because we were consultants making, profits. But I saw it as this beautiful like ecosystem of relationships and a lot of vulnerability. And I think back on some of the rejection I received, but I didn't see it as that way. So
Right.
anyway, all the way up to like 20 years later, I'm now in a space, and I just got off a phone call where I'm creating and supporting cohorts and consortiums where folk can come together and truly show up in the operational essence of operating a utility in the power grid and all the challenges, and sharing best practices, guidelines, lessons learned. But the key to do that is really using language around this soft, vulnerable, authentic space, which is kind of not what you think of when you think of a bunch of executives or senior management leaders getting into a room. But that's truly where the knowledge sharing begins, and the openness to share that and be non-competitive and be vulnerable. So I just find it fascinating. Like many times I didn't know I was leading with vulnerability probably 20 years ago, but now when I look back, like that was probably, for
Right.
some reason I felt comfortable being vulnerable in many spaces.
Well,
but it
yeah, I
created a
think
lot of bonds.
it is the essence of who you are, right? I think for some of us, it's not, you know, that we can't find this space. We haven't, it hasn't been nurtured. I think we've created a system of education, it's this machoism, it's sort of the football, the metaphors. I mean, we have as a species created language to sort of communicate, right? And metaphors are frequently our common sort of mode of sort of translating things to make it understandable for people. And many of our, metaphors these days, it's about, the bigness, the
Right.
macho, and unfortunately, most of our leadership has been male dominated. And so it's been to be vulnerable as a male is really looked down on. I mean, it's more of a feminine quality. Unfortunately, it's a human quality, but it's been taken down and used in such detrimental ways to the being that it's very hard to, we've got a big hill and mountain to climb here. If we can chisel away at this a little bit and make some indentations, I mean, I think you beautifully represent what can be done in a space that's so dominated. I think most industries tend to be male dominated. Education is probably female dominated, but the, leadership is not.
The curriculum development and yeah. And I guess, I only bring that up because I just remember I never saw myself as a female as well. So like I didn't realize me showing up in that space was such a contrast until really about 3 or 4 years ago when I met a lovely woman in my career path who was like more or less gave me a few, and I just did never saw it. And so I feel like that also allowed me to feel safe. Because we are taught to armor up, right? To like look as if we're perfect and to avoid conflict and really to numb ourselves to if we are put
Right.
up against a position or a, a deadline or an ask that we probably
Right.
can't perform, but we like somehow create an environment where that's what you just go do. And so I think there are these, as you just said, where does it start and when did it start? But, it's really how we're taught to succeed. And so if we could just change that conversation, it would be just in a few rooms, I think could have a
Well,
ripple effect.
it certainly starts, and that's why I love pediatrics, and I love the opportunities to, yesterday talk with, new parents. And I mean, there is no, our great joy is having your first child and the transformation that happens because you can't read it in a book. You can prepare yourselves like we do for much of life, but there's a part of this that's you can't prepare for because your mind and your emotional response is something unique in that moment. And I don't think, we can watch movies, we can, feel the empathy towards somebody else when they're going through it. And obviously a shared experience in those respects. Um, any rate, yeah. So I think it is about being vulnerable, and I think our newborns are some of the most vulnerable moments of our life. And so, as a parent, we're there to protect them, but we're also these role models that what will shape their life going forward is a lot of what they see, and we've sort of talked about this. I think that's part of what the whole mysteries of life to me are. I don't know it all. I've learned a lot, but in doing more readings, I think we're both avid readers and different sorts, but I think the quest for knowledge and understanding, to think that we understand the human body completely is a misstatement. We're never there at the end. I think, we get treatments and different things to solve some of the problems and you know, disease states and illnesses. I mean, fortunately, most things can't be characterized as self-limited. But yeah, I think the vulnerability part is something that we don't think about. Essence, a real, big part of the human experience. That I mean, Brene Brown has done an extraordinary way of sort of like putting into words. I mean, she's an incredible speaker. Her whole life experience sort of helps to transmit this in a way that's real, that's authentic. I mean, I think that authenticity, because we certainly have a lot of things that masquerade. We have people masquerading in certain ways, and we've elevated some of these people to high positions and unfortunately end up determining some of our paths or our lives or opportunities because they then limit the experiences that we can have.
Yeah, and I was thinking, which is another word, but she did it really, and especially for the younger generation, working with the children, parenting is, the ability to name what we're feeling without that idea of shame. Or like I would think, the idea of vulnerability is a practice almost where you can be aware and even speak of it to your loved ones, and how
Right.
powerful that is to the children that you're around is, being able to share, like for instance, just last night, I picked up my daughter. She had, a beautiful evening with a new friend, and I had it was beautiful in essence, but it was with my father who's at a memory care facility now. And so like I couldn't get to her level of emotional frequency, but she actually like felt it. And so, she asked me and it was a really it ended up being a beautiful conversation, but I couldn't show up in that space. So I was just very open with like how I was feeling and then we just ended up having this really lovely
Right.
conversation. And I think there's just power in that, right? Like, is if you're aware of how you're feeling, and then you can express that emotion, and with no shame, um, you know, beautiful things can unfold. So, I mean, we're not experts at being vulnerable, but you probably interacted and worked with a lot of people. What maybe tips or practices that you've kind of shared or seen others explore in this space, especially in this very fast paced
Right.
world we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is just sort of creating spaces where you can almost sort of slow things down, right? I think we are sort of caught up in this fast pace world. And, I think it's the tips for me have been sort of becoming creating more self awareness, right? Finding ways to sort of like don't have this immediate response, right? I think one of the things I see a lot of which happens, and, we have to sort of process things sometimes and think things through to sort of, create the responses. And I think what's sort of overwhelming our system right now in medicine is this sort of immediacy of response, right? The power of thinking is less valued in some respects. The sort of Google world where everybody comes in with armed with all the knowledge and answers. And we have to sort of ferret out, what's the noise and what's the real problems. So I think, what I think just sort of one of the things mantras I've sort of talked to parents about is just being present, right? It's not about always having the answer. I think we're seen as parents as always knowing that sort of complete knowledge of everything. And I think to say that you don't know something is that other part of vulnerability, right? So I think certainly as a physician, yeah, I mean, I know a lot of things, but if you don't know something, we have resources, we have access to information, right? So I think it doesn't make you less of a physician or a person in whatever field you're in to say, gee, I don't know that answer. I need to get more information about that. And I think, but that doesn't always translate or isn't always received by, those you're in conversation with or those who arrive at your doorstep for, a treatment for something. So I think, I mean, our hope, I think, in this sort of space is sort of part to create not only the safe space, but to start beginning to change the conversation or at least equip people with more language and make the language more robust and available so that people, I mean, we need to teach this in schools, I mean, it's obviously, we've got teachers who are very adept at managing kids in school. And then there are I didn't go to Catholic school, but in the stories and things I've heard, it's you're
What?
very, that, friends and Cheech and Chong did a great routine on that, but just like, you were very strictly to abide by these rules. And we have this rules-based society, which, yes, we need rules. We need sort of a context. We need some parameters to sort of live by. But, when we live in such a tightly controlled world, it doesn't allow for the vulnerability, doesn't allow for the creativity. I mean, doodling and doing sort of things, these are outlets that we have to sort of like express ourselves. And when we're not given the space to express ourselves, and that expression is just different for every individual.
I would say, to our, really someone like being vulnerable can definitely be a space of, where you're afraid. And I think, instead of starting with being vulnerable in like a public space, you really great step is being vulnerable with yourself, right? Like the whole conversation of asking yourself where you are in that moment, can you tell yourself the truth of like, I actually feel scared or I'm overwhelmed. I mean, you don't have to tell anybody this, but you actually are um, committing to this realization that you're feeling a certain way. I mean, I think that's a great first step because I think then sharing that with others could be, your growth path per se. Um, but that is being vulnerable, right? Just being aware of what's causing you pain or.
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think that just gets to the self-awareness, and we have, not nurtured a lot of that with just how we expect, watching developmental. I think it's one of the more beautiful things that parents, when you are around to see your kids. I mean, we don't have, the paternal leave, maternity leave that we really need, because I think that's, to me, would be a great space for us to sort of expand to allow for sort of this transitory time for parents to really not only bond with their kids, but to watch and observe what's happening, and also to give them the opportunity to sort of like have more depth to that experience. Because I mean, it's a marvel, right, to watch this sort of transformation from these little ones that are just sleeping and eating, and then all of a sudden they wake up and then they start smiling and they start cooing and they start doing all these things. And we're programmed for this, but they're independent individuals who are developing their lives in these moments that each one of them make a difference, right? So each experience has some impact.
That made me think of, a transformational moment in my parenting was I read a book, The Whole Brain Child by Daniel Siegel. Dr. Daniel Siegel, he had a co-author. So it was like a neurologist and a psychologist. They came together and they actually wrote 5 books. I recommend all of them. But it was that whole idea of observing a baby and a child through the awareness of like what's happening with the development of their brain. And so the whole idea of always being in a, not all, always is perfection, but being aware that observing your child through those growth patterns, you see their behaviors so much less personally, if that makes sense. So like, for instance, a tantrum between the ages of 2, 3, and 4, like what's actually happening from a neurological like growth perspective is like so fascinating. So when you see them losing their ability to manage that, these strong emotions that they have yet to understand what they mean, instead of it being bratty or labeling it as something negative or like labels are bad, you see it as this opportunity to allow them and then coach them through that actual physical growth, let alone, their emotional growth. So anyway, that book just kind of like just the power of a book transformed how I see their physical, before they could communicate response as really expressing these like emotions and how you can, be vulnerable with them and then and
Right.
build that comfort and being in all those various realms of emotions.
Right. I mean, it gets back to, I mean, a lot of the issues that we live with are, how we incorporate how we were raised subconsciously, right? So we may not, and that's where the self-awareness comes to play. It's like, say there's certain things I'm not going to do like my parents did, right? Because, and there are certain things that even despite that come naturally because that's what we know, right? So it takes some work to change that. But I think you speak to a really important point, because I hear the language that I even hear, parents say to their kids, their infants, and they do something, they say it's bad, because they're pounding their hand or hitting, and they're 9 months old. So they're just don't even know what their arm does, right? But the fact that they swung their arm and hit somebody wasn't out of an intention to hurt somebody. But when it gets related in the context of a bad behavior, I mean, I don't have time to unpack and sort of, and my job is not to judge people, right? And I think that's the other aspect of this, is that in our conversations, it's not about judging everybody's actions, but really helping to create that self-awareness so that what actions, I mean, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? I mean, all this sort of great stuff. So, I mean, trying to understand that our actions do have impacts, emotional impact, right? So if you're saying something to someone or you use a harsh word or I think being critical or being honest sometimes has a challenge. And then I think the safety of the space that you do it in, like if you're in a meeting with a group of peers or fellow employees, it's very challenging. And managing people is very challenging. There's a lot that we don't train ourselves better. And we can't do everything to train everybody to be prepared for these things. I think there are some probably
Yeah.
pieces that we could do better in organizations.
And I love how just these random. So another thing it popped up is the 4 words. I think it's based in the 12-step program, but halt. Like, don't ever be too hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. So, like, as a parent, being with a young child, right? Like, you're not going to judge, but being aware if you were one of those 4 things and behaviors start to show, it's a
Right.
space that being aware of all the things that we just shared is so powerful, right? Like, that tantrum when you're hungry is very different when you're sated, you just fed yourself healthy food, or if you're, tired. I tell my children, listen, if you want something from me after 9:30, like, be aware. I may not show up as my best self. I just
No.
know I become tired.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the terminology now, you're hungry and angry, you're hangry, right? So we've commoditized the language in that way.
So just thinking through, a lot of things that we just shared, bringing vulnerability into like everyday life. I think one thing that we're saying is name what's true, right? So like and you don't have to say it out loud at first, but saying to yourself, I feel nervous.
Right.
I feel I need rest. And then truly start small with just being honest with yourself. And then, as you find we all have our people that we feel safe with, right? Those are our strong bonds of, our cluster. So, start with that group and then expand to the larger. And then I guess the other one was, be aware of what has come before or what has been programmed or what has been taught, whatever that may be, the shields, right? There is no perfection. This idea of people pleasing really just, or you're just too busy or hungry or tired. Those are particular
Yeah.
areas.
Well, the other thing is in this Daring Greatly book, I mean, there's so much to unpack, but there's comparison is sort of one of these pieces that we live by, right? We compare ourselves to everything. One of the things she talks about is that that's a creativity killer,
Right.
right? So when we start comparing, we're better than somebody, we're not enough. I think the essence of what sort of this vulnerability piece and shame piece is that I am enough, right? Who you are is enough. So once you start from that space that you are enough, then you can build on that.
Right.
And then the German language has some great words. So there's these words Schadenfreude and Freudenfreude. So one of the things that happens in society is that there's a lot of what they call Schadenfreude, which is basically you get joy in sort of the misfortune or things that happen to people. And we have a lot of that plays out in social media, all these things that people are just living through the joy of someone having something, not successful, something that's, down. But then the counter to that is Freudenfreude, which is basically the joy in other people's joy. And we do have a harder time sort of being happy for somebody's success, right? So especially when we have, championships, I mean, everybody's working to be the best, right? And so perfection, I think, as we've alluded to, should not be our endpoint because that is unattainable, right? Just like, the beauty in having a baby is that nobody's perfect, right? So I think we say this is the perfect moment and it's a great joyful moment. It's, we don't want it to be the end of that joy, right? But,
Yeah. And I think the idea of joy is really truly a moment, right? Which I think we've gotten away from. No one's walking around being joyful all the time or happy all the time. It's the ability to access the awareness of that moment is
right.
joyful,
Yeah.
because otherwise you get real depressed because you're not going to be joyful all the time.
Right. And joy doesn't have to be just in a birthday, a wedding, or that kind of celebration. I mean, there's joy in just many different types of successes. So I think, yeah, but we've made it very much, we also are this demonstration society where with social media, everybody is sort of showing themselves to the world. That's a whole nother area of challenge, especially for the youth and I think for the teenagers and the people who are trying to, sort of figure out who they are in this journey of life, and that there can be some very powerful moments that people can be taken down pretty seriously in these spaces. And, I think trying to sort of help each of us through those moments. Some of this it's not the inoculation against sort of the downsides of the life experiences, but how do we help to build people up and sort of like an immunity, right? That we can build sort of a wherewithal to sort of navigate life's many turns. And I think that's part of what vulnerability is. It's like the opportunity for growth and sort of like knowing that you have this capacity to sort of look within yourselves. I think you said, you can't just share this with anybody because not every space allows you to necessarily be all.
Right, you have to read the room.
No, it's very true.
Well, this is lovely. So, I think we thinking through creating the space, creating the community. Hopefully, we dropped some seeds of inspiration. I know we
Right.
always have a quote or a book recommendation before we wrap it
Well, I
up.
think yeah, so she quotes, it's a long one, but this was her. So the phrase daring greatly came from a Teddy Roosevelt speech that he gave, I guess in the Sorbonne in Paris back in 1910. Crazy. And it goes like this. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who does great enthusiasms, great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who is at best knows in the end the triumph of achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. So it's sort of like if you showed up for the championship game and you did your best, there is joy and there is something to be said for that, right? It's not necessarily the measure of success isn't just the winning. It's like showing up and doing your best or doing what you can.
I definitely hits well, especially in this time of chaos, and especially, being a voice to the children that were around. It's okay to admit that you're not okay, but that you are present, right? And also that you don't have the answers, but I'm listening, and that we can really, it's not a weakness. It's really just, I think, a sign of leadership to really lean into it and be a part of the conversation, and the desire to be aware of what you're sharing and what you're thinking and how that impacts others.
Right. And I would just add to that is that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, or in moments of time where we do need to ask for help. And that is a greater sign of strength.
Well, I think it's lovely. So, hope today's conversation sparked something in you. Maybe it did, as I said, gave you the language or just to validate, to be aware of your feelings and remind you that you're not alone with that. Keep illuminating.
This is illuminating being is sort of does speak to what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to sort of shine a light on this human experience.
Great.
All
Great.
right. Always
Well,
good to
thank
see
you.
you.
See ya.
Have a great day.